Chapter 8. Globalization and International Trade Effects on Employment and Prosperity. Keynes's general theory explains that increases in spending on domestically produced goods and services creates additional profit opportunities for enterprises producing goods and domestic located factories. It follows that the managers of these enterprises would be encouraged to hire additional workers whenever additional profit opportunities exist if more products are produced to sell in the market. In the closed economy model of most textbooks, where all market transactions are among residents of the same national economy, it is implicitly assumed that the additional spending would come from domestic households, domestic business firms and/or federal, state or local governments to be spent to purchase the output produced by enterprises located in the domestic economy. Once the analysis is placed into a globalized market system involving many separate nations, things change. For example, spending by United States households, business firms, and even a federal, state or local US government may go to purchase imports, that is, goods produced in foreign nations. Domestic spending on imports creates profit and job opportunities in foreign nations and not in the domestic industry's economy. On the other hand, demand by foreigners for goods and services produced domestically, that is, exports, creates profits and jobs for workers in the domestic economy. If, for example, in any year, exports from nation A equals the imports into nation A, then the foreign profits and job creating effects of nation A's imports will approximately equal the domestic profits job creation opportunities in nation A's export industries. If, however, there is free international trade between nations and nation A imports significantly more than it exports to foreigners, then nation A spending on imports may, in general, support more profit opportunities and jobs in foreign nations than nation A's export sales, creating profit and job opportunities for enterprises located in nation A. Nation A is said to be experiencing an unfavorable balance of trade. If exports exceed imports, the nation A is experiencing a favorable balance of trade. Whenever a nation experiences an unfavorable balance of trade, its imports provide a larger stimulus to foreign economies than its export sales stimulus to the domestic economy. In 2008, for example, the United States had an unfavorable balance of trade where the US imported $709 billion more goods and services from foreign nations than it exported to foreign markets. This means that foreign nations had a favorable balance of trade with the United States and consequently spent $709 billion less on imports from the United States than they earned on their exports to the United States. Suppose China, Japan, India and other US trading partners who had a favorable balance of trade with US had spent on importing US production of goods their entire 2008 export dollar earnings on sales in US markets instead of not spending, saving the $709 billion of their earnings from exports to the USA. This hypothetical additional $709 billion spending by these trading partners on United States exports would have been an additional stimulus in 2008 to the US economy equal to approximately 95% of the stimulus that the US federal government authorized in the Obama stimulus spending stimulus bill enacted by the US Congress in 2008 to alleviate the effects of the Great Recession. Since 1974, the United States has been consistently spending more on imports than it receives in sales revenue from exports, thereby creating more profit opportunities and jobs in foreign nations than foreigners have been creating for the United States and its export industries. The result has been that the United States has acted as the major engine for economic growth for the rest of the world's industries for more than 4 decades. The impressive economic growth rates displayed by countries like Japan in the 1980s and China and India in the early years of the 21st century owe that prosperity in large part to the United States' increases in spending on imports from these nations. A simple example will illustrate this situation. Let us assume that in any one year the United States spends $10 billion more on Chinese imports, say toys, and therefore $10 billion less on domestically produced toys. Assume that simultaneously China does not increase spending on any United States exports. The US unfavorable balance of trade deficit with China will increase by $10 billion. The effect is that this $10 billion spent by US residents on toy imports from China created profits and jobs in the Chinese toy industry. US residents who diverted their spending on domestically produced toys to foreign produced toys have destroyed potential profit opportunities and jobs in the United States toy industry. In this hypothetical example, China has saved $10 billion out of its international export earnings, since in the Keynes analysis a penny saved is a penny that cannot be earned by anyone else. Then in this hypothetical example, the $10 billion the Chinese saved is $10 billion that cannot be earned by businesses and workers located in the United States. In discussing the problem of unemployment in the United States, former Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke spoke of this foreign nations hoarding a dollar earning from exports to the USA as a glut of savings overseas. Any nation experiencing an unfavorable balance of trade must finance its trade deficit by either 1. The deficit nation drawing down its previous savings on international earnings. These savings are called the nation's foreign reserves, to pay for its excess of imports over exports. Or 2. By the deficit nation borrowing funds from the foreigners in the rest of the world to pay for the difference between the value of imports and the value of exports. Since the United States imports have exceeded exports every year since 1974, the United States has borrowed from foreigners to finance its excess of imports over exports. The result has been that the United States has moved from being the world's largest creditor nation to being the largest debtor nation in terms of debt owed to the rest of the world. To continue with our previous illustrative example, we might ask, what do the Chinese do with this $10 billion savings on its international trade earnings? Like all savers, the Chinese look for liquid assets to store their international savings, which then can be used, in the future, to settle international contractual obligations. The Chinese have used a significant portion of their international savings to purchase United States Treasury securities. This indicates that the Chinese believe the United States dollar is the safest harbor for storing their unused international contractual settlement power savings. This savings by the Chinese have led many classical theory experts to state that the Chinese have been financing the American consumer shopping spree and the resulting growth of United States international debt. These experts have warned that if nations such as China stop buying United States securities with their international savings out of international earnings from exports to the United States, then American consumers could no longer afford to buy as many imports and they would have to reduce their purchases of Chinese-made goods at retail outlets like Walmart. The large sums that American consumers spend on imports over the years has generated significant profit and job opportunities for the Chinese. If, for any reason, Americans stopped buying Chinese imports, imagine how this would devastate the profits of Chinese firms and threaten the jobs of Chinese workers. The result could even cause political unrest in China. The Chinese Communist Party enjoys popular support as long as it not only protects the nation from foreign enemies but also as long as it continues to support economic actions that result in improvement in employment and living conditions for all Chinese citizens. In other words, politically as well as economically, it is unlikely to be in China's interest to stop financing Americans' huge Chinese imports over exports to China. Suppose the Chinese did not use their international savings to buy United States Treasury bonds. Instead, assume, as in our illustrative example, the Chinese spent the $10 billion toy export earnings on the products of American domestically located export industries. The result would be that China would have more products from American producers. Suppose the Chinese spent more on US agricultural exports such as meat, corn and wheat. If more of these food products were available in China, they would strongly embellish and improve the standard food diet of the average Chinese worker. American businesses and their workers would earn more income and therefore the US would not have to borrow from the Chinese to finance their large import purchases of Chinese goods. The moral of this illustration is that if the Chinese would spend more of their export dollar earnings buying US produced goods instead of buying United States Treasury bonds, then the Chinese government would make available US produced goods to the Chinese population that then would improve Chinese real living standards while more American workers would be employed and would earn enough income to afford all the Chinese imports they are buying, but without the US going into debt to the Chinese. This simple illustration suggests that one engine of growth that a nation such as China might try is to obtain a favorable balance of trade by increasing its exports to the rest of the world. If successful, such an export expansion-led growth policy will result in increasing profits for enterprises and creating jobs for domestic workers. If, however, Any one country runs a favorable balance of trade, then other nations must run an unfavorable balance of trade, resulting in a tendency to lose jobs and profits to the nation pursuing an export-led growth policy. Thus, as Keynes noted, if each nation tries to stimulate its economy by running a favorable balance of trade, then this may lead to a senseless international competition for a favorable balance of trade which injures all alike. 1. Keynes and his post-Keynesian followers have developed a solution for promoting growth among trading nations while preventing competition among nations to obtain export-led growth via a favorable balance of trade. This solution will end persistent trade imbalances that cause the nation with an unfavorable balance of trade to lose profit in job opportunities while incurring huge international debts. What is required is some form of an institutional arrangement that prevents any persistent trade imbalance among nations by creating an arrangement that induces the creditor nation with the export surplus to spend more on the products of other debtor nations. In contrast, the classical efficient market theory solution to this persistent trade imbalance problem is to argue that all the pressure should be on the debtor nation to reduce its imports relative to its exports. According to classical theory, one way this can occur is to let the free market determine currency exchanges rates that will end the trade imbalance problem. The classical theory maintains that if the Chinese currency, the renminbi, was traded in a free flexible foreign exchange market without any interference by the Chinese government, and if the United States ran an unfavorable balance of trade with the Chinese, then the demand for the Chinese currency would substantially increase in value relative to the US dollar. As a result, the retail dollar price in the United States of Chinese goods would rise. The resulting rise in the US consumer price level would adversely affect the real income and living standards of the average employed American worker. American consumers would find that Chinese goods were becoming more expensive in terms of dollars and therefore they could no longer afford to buy as much imports from China. With the appreciation of the Chinese currency relative to the dollar, the Chinese would experience a decline in the renminbi price of United States imports and therefore the Chinese consumer could buy more imports from the United States too as their real income and living standard improved. The classical theory assumes that this change in exchange rates will continue until exports equals imports in each country. If, however, the value of the US dollar declined relative to the Chinese currency, then as the retail dollar price of Chinese imports increases, the rate of price inflation in the United States as measured by the Consumer Price Index would rise since imports are a significant portion of the American consumer budget. 3. If the Federal Reserve believes that its primary obligation is to fight a rising price level, then the Federal Reserve might ramp up its anti-inflationary policy and increase the domestic interest rate. A rise in interest rates in the United States should reduce borrowing to purchase imports and domestic produced goods, thereby reducing market demand and profit opportunities for American and Chinese business firms and therefore increase unemployment globally. But even if we assume the Federal Reserve does not engage in any anti-inflation monetary policy when the dollar price of imports rise because of a change in the exchange rates, the classical exchange rate adjustment answer will tend to reduce global output and employment. In this classical theory scenario, as Americans buy fewer Chinese imports, profits and jobs in China's export industries would be reduced, creating some unemployment and potential political unrest in China. With lower incomes in China, the Chinese market demand for United States exports declines, resulting in less US profit opportunities than otherwise made possible by the ongoing devaluation of the dollar. Clearly, such a possible scenario is neither good for the American or Chinese workers and business firms. The classical solution of the exchange rate change putting pressure on the deficit nation to reduce its import spending will release contractionary forces on the global economic system. The classical theory avoids this depressing scenario by merely assuming that with free efficient markets there will always be full employment of capital and labor in all trading nations no matter what changes occur in the exchange rate of currencies between nations as wage rates in each nation change sufficiently to produce full employment. In other words, classical theory merely assumes away the possible unemployment problem that could occur in both America and China if the free market permits the United States dollar to be devalued relative to the renminbi in order to end the United States' unfavorable balance of trade. In the long run, classical theory asserts as a matter of faith rather than as empirical evidence, there must always be full employment in all nations. 4. Thus, by loading the classical model with sufficient but unrealistic assumptions, classical theory resolves any potential trade deficit problem by merely invoking the magic of free markets for foreign exchange of currencies, in a world where the future is known, at least in the long run. Some more pragmatic economists have noted that historically, when exchange rates have been permitted to change relatively freely in the market, the results have often been devastating for a nation. Consequently, some experts have advocated a foreign exchange market where a market maker actually fixes the exchange rate at some pre-announced level. As a result, very often economic discussions on the requirements for a good international payment system have been limited to this question of the advantages and disadvantages of fixed versus flexible exchange rates. The facts of experience since the end of the Second World War plus Keynes's revolutionary liquidity analysis indicates that more is required than merely deciding whether exchange rates should be fixed or freely flexible. A mechanism must be designed to adequately resolve any persistent trade and international payments imbalances that could occur whether the exchange rates are fixed or flexible. The mechanism should be designed not only to resolve these imbalance problems but also to simultaneously to help promote global full employment, rather than just assume global full employment will always occur. Such a mechanism was embedded in the Bretton Woods-Keynes plan for international trade and payment imbalances. The Bretton Woods solution. In 1944, as the Second World War was winding down, the victorious Allied nations organized a conference at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The purpose of this Bretton Woods conference was to design a post-war international payments system. Keynes was the chief representative of the United Kingdom delegation. In contrast to the classical view of the desirability of free exchange rate markets, Keynes's position was that there is an incompatibility thesis in the classical theory approach to international trade and finance. Keynes argued that permitting free trade, flexible exchange rates and free capital mobility across international borders can be incompatible with the economic goal of global full employment and rapid economic growth. Keynes offered an alternative analysis to the classical approach to the problem. This alternative was the Keynes plan solution, an arrangement that would make international trade and international financial flow arrangements compatible with global full employment and vigorous global economic growth while, when necessary, permitting nations to introduce controls on any flow of capital funds that was being sent across national boundaries. Keynes argued that the main cause of failure of any traditional international payments system, whether based on fixed or flexible exchange rates, was its inability to actively foster continuous global economic expansion whenever persistent trade, payment imbalances occurred among trading nations. This failure, Keynes wrote, can be traced to a single characteristic. I ask close attention to this, because I shall argue that this provides a clue to the nature of any alternative which is to be successful. It is characteristic of a freely convertible international standard that it throws the main burden of adjustment on the country which is in the debtor position on the international balance of payments, that is, on the country which is, in this context, by hypothesis the weaker and above all the smaller in comparison with the other side of the scales which, for this purpose, is the rest of the world. 5. Keynes concluded that an essential improvement in designing any international payment system requires transferring the major onus of adjustment from the debtor to the creditor nation when any persistent international payments imbalance develops. This transfer of responsibility for ending persistent international payment imbalances to those nations that experience exports that exceed their imports and are therefore in the creditor position would, Keynes explained, substitute an expansionist, in place of a contractionist, pressure from world trade. To achieve a golden era of economic development, Keynes recommended combining a fixed, but adjustable, exchange rate system with a mechanism for requiring the nation enjoying a favorable balance of trade to initiate most of the effort necessary to eliminate this trade imbalance, while maintaining enough discipline in the debtor countries to prevent them from exploiting the new ease allowed them. 6. During the Second World War, millions of people had been killed or wounded. Industrial and residential centers in most of Europe lay in ruins. By the end of the war, Europe was on the brink of famine as agricultural production had been disrupted by the war. Transportation infrastructure was in shambles. The war-torn capitalist nations in Europe did not have sufficient undamaged productive resources available to produce enough to feed their populations and much less to rebuild their economies. The only major economic power in the world that was not significantly damaged by the war was the United States. European rebuilding would require the European nations to run huge import purchases with the United States in order to meet their economic needs for a rebuilding recovery. At the same time, these European nations did not possess undamaged production facilities to produce goods to sell to the US in order to earn dollars to buy US exports. The European nations also had very little foreign reserves, so they could not draw down these reserves sufficiently to buy American exports. At the time, the major foreign reserves were in the form of the asset gold. The only alternative, under a free market laissez-faire system, would be for Europeans to obtain an enormous volume of dollar loans from the private sector of the United States to finance the purchase of United States exports needed to feed the European population and rebuild their economies. Private sector lenders in the United States, however, were mindful that German reparation payments to the victorious Allied nations after the First World War were primarily financed by American private investors lending to Germany, the so-called Dawes Plan. Germany never repaid these Dawes Plan loans. Given this history of a nation defaulting on international debt repayments after a major war and the existing circumstances immediately after the Second World War, it was obvious that private lending facilities in the United States could not be expected to provide the loans necessary for European recovery. The Keynes Plan, presented at the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference, would require the United States, as the obvious major creditor nation, to accept the major responsibility for curing the post-war trade imbalance, where a tremendous amount of goods from the United States would be necessary to feed the populations in Europe while simultaneously rebuilding the factories and infrastructure necessary to re-establish viable productive European economies. Where were the Europeans going to get the finance to purchase all the necessary goods from the United States? Keynes estimated that the European nations might require in excess of $10 billion to purchase United States exports for such a post-war rebuilding of the European economies. The Keynes Plan had an operational system that would have the United States simply provide these funds to the Europeans. The United States representative to the Bretton Woods Conference, Harry Dexter White, stated that the US Congress would never provide the $10 billion that Keynes estimated was the minimum required funding. Instead, White argued, the United States Congress might be willing to provide, at most, $3 billion as the United States contribution to solving this post-war international financial problem for rebuilding European economies. The United States delegation at the Bretton Woods Conference was the most important participant. It was clear that nothing could be done unless the United States delegation agreed to any plan that was developed at the conference. White had the US delegation veto the Keynes Plan. Instead, White provided a plan that set up the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and what we now call the World Bank. The White Plan envisioned the International Monetary Fund, IMF, providing short-term loans to nations running unfavorable balances of trade. These loans were supposed to give the debtor nation time to rebuild its economic structure and then stop importing more than it was exporting. Then these debtor nations were to pay off their debt to the IMF by earnings from their exports exceeding their import purchases. Under the White Plan, the United States would subscribe a maximum of $3 billion as its contribution to the IMF lending facilities. The World Bank would borrow funds from the free market. These World Bank funds would then be used to provide long-term loans for rebuilding capital facilities and making capital improvements, initially in the war-torn nations and later in the less developed countries. When the new facilities were in place, it was assumed that sufficiently more goods could be produced and sold profitably. Then the nation would use the new income earned from the new facilities to pay off the World Bank loans. This White Plan suggested by the US delegation was basically the institutional arrangements adopted at the Bretton Woods Conference. Under this White Plan, international loans from the IMF or the World Bank were the only available sources for financing the huge volume of imports from the United States that the war-torn nations would require immediately after the Second World War. It turned out, however, that the IMF and World Bank together did not have sufficient funds to make loans of the magnitude needed by the European nations. But even if the IMF and the World Bank could have provided loans sufficient to meet the needs of the war-torn nations, the result would have been a huge international indebtedness of these nations. Paying off this immense debt obligations would require the European population to accept the main burden of adjustment by them being willing to tighten their belts. In the 21st century international lexicon, the debtor nation should adopt a strict austerity program. This belt-tightening statement is a euphemism to indicate that the debtor nations would have to dramatically reduce their consumption spending for imports and even goods produced domestically. Such a plan could be put into effect only by reducing the income of the residents of European nations so they only can afford to buy let output from both foreign and domestic enterprises, while the nation is simultaneously paying the annual debt servicing charges. This implied no significant improvement in the standard of living of Europeans for years to come. The result would so depress Europeans as to possibly inducing political revolutions in most of Western Europe. Not inconsequentially, the tighten your belt policies also would have limited Europe as a possible large profitable market in the future for American exporters. To avoid the possibility of many European nations facing a desperate electorate that might opt for a communist system when faced with the dismal future the White Plan offered, the United States developed an alternative plan in the hope that communism did not spread west from the Soviet Union to the democratic European nations. In 1948, President Truman recommended Congress accept the Marshall Plan, despite White's arguments that the United States would not be willing to give more than $3 billion to solving this international payments problem. The Congress approved the Marshall Plan, which provided $5 billion in foreign aid in 18 months and a total of $13 billion in 4 years. Adjusted for inflation, this $13 billion sum is equivalent to approximately $170 billion in 2017 dollars. The Marshall Plan was essentially a 4-year gift of $13 billion worth of American exports to the war-devastated nations. The Marshall Plan required no repayment by the recipients of these funds, and hence no belt-tightening. The 1948 Marshall Plan gifts gave the recipient nations a sufficient number of dollars to buy approximately 2% of the total annual output, gross domestic product of the United States each year for 4 years. Despite Americans giving away 2% of their national income per annum, there was no real sacrifice for American households associated with the Marshall Plan, as the remaining income was significantly greater than pre-war levels. The United States standard of living during the first year of the Marshall Plan was still 25% larger than it had been in the last peacetime year of 1940. American household income continued to grow throughout the Marshall Plan period. The Marshall Plan funds created profit opportunities for American firms and jobs for US workers. Full employment was readily sustained. Immediately after the war ended, US government military spending was significantly reduced, which by itself might have created a post-war unemployment problems. Offsetting this reduction in government military spending was the Marshall Plan funds spending that created significant increases in employment in United States export industries, just as several million men and women were discharged from the United States Armed Forces and entered the United States civilian labor force looking for jobs. For the first time in its history, the United States did not suffer from a severe recession due to a lack of spending immediately following the cessation of a major war and a reduction in military spending by the federal government. The United States and most of the rest of the world experienced an economic free lunch, as both the potential debtor nations and the creditor nation experienced tremendous real economic gains resulting from the Marshall Plan and other foreign aid giveaways. Despite the growth in output from foreign factories, however, the United States maintained a surplus merchandise trade balance of exports over imports until the first oil price shock in 1973. By 1958, however, although the United States still had an annual goods and services export surplus of over $5 billion, the post-war United States potential international payments surplus was at an end. By that time, United States governmental foreign and military aid to allied nations exceeded $6 billion. There was also a net private capital outflow of $1.6 billion from the United States that financed United States companies investing in productive facilities abroad. This total of $7.60 outflow of funds more than offset the earnings of the $5 billion export surplus by $2.6 billion. In other words, by 1958, the international payments account of the United States saw a net outflow of $2.6 billion despite export earnings exceeding spending on imports by $5 billion. The post-war United States international payments surplus was at an end. As the United States' total international payments account swung into deficit in 1958, other nations began to experience international payments surpluses. These credit surplus nations did not spend their payments surpluses on additional imports from the United States. Instead, the nations used their unspent annual dollar surpluses to purchase the international liquid asset, which at that time was the gold reserves of the United States. For example, in 1958, the United States sold over $2 billion in gold reserves to foreign central banks. These trends accelerated in the 1960s, partly as a result of increased United States military and financial aid in response to the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, and later because of the US's increasing military involvement in Vietnam. At the same time, a rebuilt Europe and Japan became important producers of exports, so that the rest of the world became less dependent on purchasing export products solely from United States industries. Still, the United States maintained a surplus merchandise trade balance of exports over imports until the first oil price shock in 1973, more than offsetting this trade surplus during most of the 1960s. However, were foreign and military aid dollar outflows to other nations plus net capital outflows from the United States that financed United States companies investing in facilities abroad. Consequently, during the 1960s years, the United States experienced an annual unfavorable total balance of international payments. The Bretton Woods system had no way of automatically forcing the emerging creditor nations experiencing an international payments surplus to step up and accept the responsibility for resolving the persistent payments imbalances, a creditor adjustment role that contributed so wonderfully to post-Second World War global economic growth. A creditor role that the United States had started playing in 1948 with the Marshall Plan. Instead, during the 1960s, the surplus nations continued to convert some portion of their annual dollar international payment receipt surpluses into demands on United States gold reserves to be stored as a liquid asset for savings that could be used anytime in the future to meet international payments obligations. As surplus nations in the 1960s drained gold reserves from the United States, the seeds of the destruction of the Bretton Woods system and the golden age of global economic development were being sown. In 1971, President Richard Nixon closed the gold window. Nixon stated that the United States government would no longer sell gold to foreign nations who had earned dollars and wanted to use these dollars to buy gold from the United States rather than buy produced goods and services from American business firms. Nixon's closing of the gold window had, in essence, indicated that the United States was unilaterally withdrawn from any Bretton Woods agreement. At that point of time, the last vestiges of Keynes's enlightened international monetary approach, where the creditor nation accepts a large responsibility for correcting persistent international payments imbalances, was on its way to be forgotten. Reforming the international payments system. The post-Second World War global golden age of economic development required international institutions and United States government foreign aid policies that operated on principles inherent in the Keynes plan, where the creditor nation accepting the major responsibility for solving any persistent international payments imbalance. The formal Bretton Woods Agreement, however, did not require creditor nations to take such actions. Since Nixon's closing of the gold window in 1971, the onus has been on nations with deficits in their trade and international payments balances to solve their own international deficit payments problems, usually through some policy of austerity. The result has been that since 1971 the international payments system often impedes rapid economic growth and even induces contractionary forces on many nations of the world. Utilizing the ideas Keynes presented at Bretton Woods, it is possible to update the Keynes plan for a 21st century international monetary payments scheme that would eliminate persistent unfavorable payments imbalances, promote global economic prosperity, and still meet the political realities of today without bowing one's knee to efficient market advocates. 4. As Keynes wrote, to suppose, as the classical theory does, that there exists some smoothly functioning automatic free market mechanism of adjustment which preserves equilibrium if only we trust to methods of laissez-faire, is a doctrinaire delusion which disregards the lessons of historical experience without having behind it the support of sound theory. 7. Since the 1990s, there has been several international finance crises. In 1994, when the Mexican government was faced with difficulties in trying to service its international debt repayments, some pragmatic policymakers recognized that free markets do not provide a system that automatically prevents a crisis in the international payments sector. In some cases, instead of relying on the market to solve the problem, these pragmatists advocated the creation of some sort of crisis manager to stop international financial market liquidity hemorrhaging and to bail out the international investors. In 1994, United States Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin encouraged President Clinton to use American funds to lend to Mexico to solve its financial crisis and thereby save the wealth of international buyers of Mexican bonds. This solved the problem. In other cases, when the solution was left to the free market, severe economic problems developed. In 1997, for example, Thailand, Malaysia, and other East Asian nations experienced an international currency crisis that battered their economies. In 1998, the Russian debt default caused another international financial crisis that led to the collapse of the long-term capital management (LTCM) hedge fund, which, except for quick action by pragmatists at the New York Federal Reserve Bank, could have induced a significant drop in American equity markets. We should note that among the principals of LTCM was Nobel Prize economist winner Myron Scholes, who won his Nobel Prize for discovering the formula for free market properly pricing risk in an efficient financial market environment. Scholes' formula, however, could not save LTCM from its after-the-fact recognized investment blunder into Russian bonds by not correctly pricing the risks involved in such an investment. At the time of the Russian debt default and the LTCM collapse, President Clinton called for a new financial architecture for international financial market transactions. The then International Monetary Fund Director Stanley Fischer, who in 2014 Obama appointed as Vice Chair of the Federal Reserve, recognized that the IMF did not have sufficient funds to stem the international financial crisis that was occurring. Fischer suggested that the major nations of the world, the so-called G7 nations, make a temporary arrangement where they would provide additional financing to help provide funds to any nation suffering from deficits in its international payments imbalances until such nations could get their economic house in order. Fischer's cry for a G7 temporary collaboration to provide funds to deficit nations is equivalent to recruiting a volunteer fire department to douse the flames after someone has cried fire in a crowded theater. Even if the fire is ultimately extinguished, there will be a lot of innocent casualties. Moreover, every new currency fire would require the G7 voluntary fire department to pour more liquidity into the market to put out the flames. Clearly, a more desirable goal would be to produce a permanent fire prevention system, and not to rely on organizing larger and larger volunteer firefighting companies with each new currency crisis. In other words, crisis prevention rather than crisis management should be the policy goal. President Clinton's clarion call for a new international financial architecture implicitly recognized the need for a permanent prevention institutional arrangement in the existing international payments system. Unfortunately, President Clinton's call was not taken up as the international community managed to muddle through the experience, although some nations and its residents suffered severe economic pains. Beginning in 2007, the global economic system again experienced a global financial crisis, a crisis of much larger proportions than those in the 1990s. The US subprime mortgage derivatives problem created a contagious disease that caused havoc with banking systems in many other countries, including Germany, the United Kingdom, France, Spain, Greece, and others. The contagion caused the almost complete collapse of the Icelandic banking system and even the Swiss banking system, usually considered a paragon of financial stability, appeared for a while to be in severe economic trouble. The need for a new international financial architecture is clearly more urgent than ever. In the 21st century interdependent global economy, a substantial degree of economic cooperation among trading nations is essential. The original Keynes plan for reforming the international payments system called for the creation of a single supranational central bank. Given the problems the European Union has suffered despite it possessing a supranational European Central Bank, suggests that perhaps an institutional arrangement that avoids such a supranational central bank may be more desirable in that it permits participating nations to still manage their own monetary policy in the way the government thinks is in the best interests of its residents. Reforming the international payments system. An international financial architecture system to deal with persistent trade imbalances and any international financial crisis can be developed to operate under the same economic principles laid down by Keynes at Bretton Woods. But this system does not require the establishment of a supranational central bank of the world as Keynes suggested in his Keynes plan at Bretton Woods. Instead, this new international payment system is aimed at obtaining a more acceptable international agreement, given today's political climate in most nations, that does not require any nation to surrender the nation's control of either its domestic banking system or the operation of its domestic monetary and fiscal policies to a supranational authority. Each nation will still be able to use monetary and fiscal policies to determine the domestic economic destiny that is best for its citizens as long as it does not detrimentally affect employment and income earning opportunities in other trading partner nations. What is required is a closed, double-entry bookkeeping clearing institution to keep the international payments score among the various trading nations plus some mutually agreed upon rules enforced by the clearing institution to solve the problems of persistent trade and international payment imbalances. It will also require an international agreement and a method to prevent international financial market transactions that can cause a financial market crisis that would be disruptive to the stability of any nation's economy as well as a threat to the global economy. The new international institution to be set up under this plan could be labeled the International Monetary Clearing Union, IMCU. The IMCU would require all international payments between nations whether for imports or financial funds crossing national borders to go through this International Monetary Clearing Union. Each nation's central bank will set up a deposit account with the IMCU. Then any payments of a resident entity in nation A made to a resident entity in nation B will have to clear through each nation's central bank deposit at the IMCU. A payment from a resident in nation A to a resident in nation B when cleared through the IMCU would appear as a credit for nation's B central bank account at the IMCU and as debit to nation's A central bank's account at the IMCU. Although this may seem to be a complicated process to the average layperson, it is merely an international version of how checks are cleared when a resident of one region of the United States, say California, pays other entities in another region, say New York. These checks clear through the clearinghouse mechanism set up by the United States Federal Reserve System. This IMCU is a 21st century variant of the Keynes plan. To operate it would require several technical properties to assure it can enforce rules that deal with all types of international financial problems. These technical requirements are spelled out in more detail in my book Post-Keynesian Theory and Policy. At this point, rather than letting the exposition getting bogged down in some technical details, it is more appropriate to indicate how this IMCU proposal works to end the possibility of persistent trade imbalances and disruptive flows of financial funds across national borders. Simultaneously, this IMCU would be encouraging global full employment and economic growth. The object of this International Monetary Clearing Union is to prevent a lack of global effective market demand for the products of industry occurring due to international liquidity problems occurring whenever any nation holds either excessive idle foreign reserves in its deposit account at the IMCU. The IMCU would have the power to encourage sufficient spending globally to produce enough profit incentives in export industries of nations to help assure global full employment. To provide an automatic mechanism for placing a major burden of correcting international trade and payments imbalances on the nation running persistent payments surpluses. To provide each nation with the ability to monitor and, if desired, to control international cross-border movements of flight financial funds, as well as money moved across national borders in order to avoid paying taxes on such funds, and, b. of earnings from illegal activities leaving the nation, and, c. to prevent funds that cross borders to finance terrorist operations. To expand the quantity of the IMCU liquid international financial asset used in settling international contracts commitments as global capacity warrants while protecting the international purchasing power of this IMCU asset. The IMCU system would have a built-in mechanism to encourage any nation that runs persistent trade surpluses of exports over imports to spend what is deemed, in advance, by agreement of the international community to be excessive credit balances, savings of foreign liquid reserve assets that have been deposited in the nation's central bank's deposit account at the IMCU. These accumulated credits, saving out of international earned income, represent funds that the creditor nation could have used to buy the products of foreign industries but instead used to increase its foreign reserves in terms of its deposit at the IMCU. When a nation holds excessive credits in its deposit account at the IMCU, it would mean that these excess credits are creating significant unemployment problems and the lack of profitable opportunities for business enterprises somewhere in the global economy. The Keynes principle involved in this situation is to recognize that if the creditor nation spends internationally its excessive credits, this spending will increase profit opportunities and the hiring of workers around the globe and thereby promote global full employment. It will also provide the opportunity for borrowers around the world to potentially earn more income that can be used to service any international debt obligations that they may owe. The Keynes solution would encourage the creditor nation to spend these excessive credits at the IMCU in 3 possible ways, all beneficial to the global economy. These 3 ways are: on the products, exports of any other deficit member nation of the IMCU, on new direct foreign investment projects in other IMCU member nations, and/or to provide foreign aid, similar to the Marshall Plan, to deficit IMCU members. The credit nation is free to choose any combination of the above 3 ways to spend its excessive credit at the IMCU, but it must spend its excessive credits to help the deficit nation. If the creditor nation spends its excessive credits on imports from foreign producers, the result will be that the surplus nation's trade imbalance will be reduced while it is creating additional profits opportunities and labor hiring in other nations. This means more income for people and businesses in the nations previously experiencing unfavorable balances of trade and who were depleting the deposit at the IMCU and/or borrowing from foreigners to buy their excess of imports over exports. In essence, this excess credit IMCU deposit spending on imports gives the deficit nations the opportunity to work their way out of international debt by earning additional income by selling additional exports to their creditors. Certainly this is a more preferable solution than requiring the deficit nations to adopt an austerity program which will reduce its purchases of imports such as that advocated by some European Union nations on debtor countries such as Greece. Direct foreign investment spending requires the nation with excess credits in its IMCU account to build plant and equipment in the deficit nation, thereby immediately increasing profits, jobs and income in the construction industries in the deficit nation and then creating jobs opportunities in manning the new plant and equipment when construction is completed. If the nation receiving this direct foreign investment is a less developed country, then this foreign direct investment spending helps to build the facilities of this less developed country up to 21st century standards. Foreign aid spending provides the deficit nation with a gift that it can use to reduce its debt obligations and/or buy additional products from foreign producers without going further into debt. These 3 spending alternatives encourage the surplus nation to accept a major responsibility for correcting trade and international payments imbalances. Nevertheless, this provision gives the trade surplus creditor country considerable discretion in deciding how to accept the onus of adjustment in the way it believes is in its residents' best interests. It does not permit, however, the surplus nation to shift the burden to the deficit nation, by lending the deficit nation or nations more and therefore imposing on any deficit nation additional contractual debt repayments obligations independent of what the deficit nation can afford to repay. The important thing is to make sure that continual over-saving by the surplus nation in the form of international liquid reserves are not permitted to unleash contractionary economic forces on other nations and or to build up of international debts, so encumbering as to impoverish the global economy of the 21st century. In the event that the surplus nation does not spend or give away the credits that are deemed excessive within a specified time, then the IMCU managers would confiscate and redistribute to debtor members the portion of credits deemed excessive. This last resort is the equivalent of a 100% taxes on a nation's excessive liquidity holdings that the international community has already agreed are excessive. Since continual excessive liquidity holdings implies continuing and excessive unemployment in one or more nations running trade deficits, if the surplus nation does not spend its excessive surplus, then confiscating these excessive credits and providing them to debtor nations will not only benefit the debtors but improve the global employment rate and output. Of course, the nation with excessive credits will recognize that these credits are subject to a 100% tax if not spent. It is therefore highly unlikely that this confiscatory tax will ever have to be enforced. Under either a fixed or a flexible rate system with each nation free to decide how much it will import, some nations will, at times, experience persistent trade deficits merely because their trading partners are not living up to their means. That is because other nations are continually saving, hoarding, a portion of their foreign export earnings in its IMCU deposit rather than spending it on the products of foreign workers and enterprises. By so doing, these oversavers are creating a lack of global market demand for the products that global industries can produce. Under the Keynes principle requiring creditor nations to spend excessive credits, deficit countries would no longer have to tighten their belts and to install austerity measures reducing the income of their residents in an attempt to reduce imports and thereby reduce their payment imbalance because others are excessively over-saving. Instead, the system would seek to remedy the payment deficit by increasing opportunities for deficit nations to sell more products profitably abroad, thereby earning more income and thus work their way out of their otherwise deteriorating debtor position. As the 2007 to 2008 global financial crisis deepened, some recognized that merely attempting to tinker with the existing system by perhaps upgrading the power of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank or encouraging the G7 to again act as a volunteer fire department did not solve the international trade and financial payments problems. For years now the international system has been running into trouble while patches to the existing IMF and World Bank system were applied in a vain attempt to end these global trade and payments problems. The world lost a great opportunity in 1944 when the United States vetoed the Keynes plan at Bretton Woods. Let us hope we do not squander this opportunity again. When the 2009 Obama stimulus recovery spending plan took effect, whatever economic recovery that the American economy experienced again placed the United States as the engine of growth for China and many other less developed nations. It tended to aggravate the United States international payments imbalance problem as, after 2009, the United States began again to increase its imports by a greater amount than its increasing volume of exports. If this result continues, then, under the existing international payments system, the result may be to create an atmosphere where men fear the status of the dollar as the most liquid safe harbor foreign reserve asset. Such fears can only roil global financial markets and plunge the global economy into further crisis and recession. If this were to occur, it should be even more obvious that a reform of the international trade and payments system is necessary if we are not to further aggravate any global economic crisis. Hopefully, the leaders of the major nations will recognize the need to adopt some form of the Keynes plan such as the IMCU if the global economy is ever to reinstate prosperous times for all the nations on Earth. The case for capital controls. Since the future is uncertain, at any moment of time some event, ephemeral or not, may occur which can make residents of a nation feel more uncertain about the prospects of their economy. Under a system of free exchange markets, residents of the nation that fear the future can remove their savings from the domestic banking system and transfer them to another nation's banking and financial system where they believe the latter is a safer harbor to store their savings. The funds used in any attempt to find a safe haven in another nation is called flight capital. If enough people try at the same time to move their funds from the domestic economy to this presumed safe harbor, the effect is similar to a run on a domestic bank that causes the bank to collapse. In the case of bank runs, a policy of insuring deposits is usually sufficient to stopping bank runs. Unfortunately, a cascade of flight capital fund movements out of a nation to a safe harbor in another nation cannot be stopped by merely insuring the deposits at domestic banks. Instead, this flight of funds, if large enough, can bring about the collapse of the domestic economy, as more and more people stop buying domestically produced goods to increase their holdings of foreign liquid assets. This creates significant recessionary pressures on the domestic economy, thereby making it more difficult for the government to undertake economic policies to stabilize the nation's economy and prevent it from falling into recession or depression. Since under the IMCU proposal all movement of funds across borders must go through the nation's central bank deposit at the IMCU, any nation can, if it desires, monitor and stop any cross-border financial fund movements by merely refusing to allow the cross-border banking transactions to be processed through the central bank's deposit on the IMCU's books. In other words, each nation can institute an effective policy to limit fund outflows from its country if, for any reason, the government deems it in the best interest of the nation's economy to prevent such fund outflows. If such a system was in place, the United States government could stop flight capital funds outflows when, for example, a Security Exchange Commission ruling prohibits sales of securities, such as mortgage-backed derivatives, that are organized by investment bankers but do not have a reliable market maker institution to ensure orderliness and liquidity. Under this capital control provision, the American financial services industries would not have to fear loss of customers and profits to foreign financial services firms who do not follow SEC rules when the SEC prohibited certain financial market activities by American financial services firms. The flow of funds could occur only if the foreign financial service firms agreed to all the SEC rules required of domestic financial service firms. Thus the playing field would be level. Finally, all movements of funds gained from illegal activities, or funds being moved from a country to another nation in order to avoid the domestic country's tax collector, or funds raised in one country that is being funneled to other countries to finance international terrorist activities must flow through the nation's central bank to the IMCU. Consequently, each nation has the facility, if it wishes to monitor and if necessary stop such cross-border money flow transactions from occurring. Clearly this is an important aspect of the IMCU plan, for it permits each nation to assure its citizens that others cannot take advantage of the international trading system to avoid paying one's fair share of taxes, and to constrain the international financing of terrorist organizations, as well as to permit the government to undermine the profitability of any international illegal drug trade. The rules of the IMCU. Only central banks can hold deposits at the IMCU. Each central bank will set its own rules regarding making available foreign monies through IMCU clearing transactions to its own bankers and private sector residents who need foreign money to settle legal international contracts denominated in terms of a foreign currency. Each nation's central bank must agree to sell their own currency, own way convertibility, against the IMCU at a specified exchange rate per IMCU deposit unit only to other nation's central bank. Each nation agrees that they hold only IMCU deposits as liquid reserve assets for international financial transactions. Accordingly, there can be no draining of reserves from the international payments system. All major private international transactions must clear between central banks' accounts in the books of the international clearing institution. The exchange rate between the domestic currency of a nation and the IMCU is set initially by each nation or currency union's central bank, just as it would be if one instituted an international gold standard. Since private enterprises that are already engaged in trade have international contractual commitments that would span the changeover interval from the current system, then, as a practical matter, one would expect, but not demand, that the existing exchange rate structure, with perhaps minor modifications, would provide the basis for initial exchange rate setting. A system to stabilize the long-term purchasing power of the IMCU in terms of each member nation's domestically produced market basket of goods can be developed. This requires a system of fixed exchange rates between each nation's local currency and the IMCU that changes only to reflect inflation and the price level of domestically produced goods. If, for example, a foreign nation permits wage price inflation to occur within its borders, then the exchange rate between the local currency and the IMCU will be devalued to reflect the inflation in the local money price of the domestic produced goods and services. For example, if this rate of domestic inflation was 5%, the exchange rate would change so that each unit of IMCU could purchase 5% more of the nation's currency. By devaluing the exchange rate between local monies and the IMCU to offset the rate of domestic inflation, the IMCU's purchasing power is stabilized and inflation in one nation cannot be exported to another via the price of the first nation's exports. By restricting use of IMCUs to central banks, private speculation regarding IMCUs as a hedge against inflation is avoided. Each nation's rate of inflation of the goods and services it produces is determined solely by the local government's policy toward the level of domestic money wages and profit margins vis-a-vis productivity gains. Each nation is therefore free to experiment with policies for preventing inflation as long as these policies do not lead to a lack of global effective demand. Whether the nation is successful or not in preventing domestic goods price inflation The IMCU will never lose its international purchasing power in terms of any domestic money. A trigger mechanism to encourage any creditor nation to spend what is deemed, in advance, by agreement of the international community to be excessive credit balances in its IMCU account. These excessive credits can be spent in three ways: a. On the products of any other member of the clearing union, b. On new direct foreign investment projects, and or c. To provide unilateral transfers, foreign aid, to deficit members. In the unlikely event that the surplus nation does not spend or give away these credits within a specified time, then the clearing agency would confiscate and redistribute to debtor members the portion of credits deemed excessive. 9. This last resort confiscatory action, a 100% taxes on excessive liquidity holdings, would make a payments adjustment via unilateral transfer payments in the current accounts. Notes: J.M. Keynes, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, London, Macmillan, 1936, pages 338-339. For technical reasons, known as when the Marshall-Lerner conditions are not applicable, that we need not discuss here, it is possible that even with a decline in the value of the United States dollar relative to the Chinese currency, the value of the trade imbalance between China and the United States would not disappear and, in the worst-case scenario, the trade imbalance between China and the United States could actually worsen. We will ignore this possible real-world complication in the following discussion to illustrate other possible deleterious effects of this classical theory solution to trade imbalances, where free markets are supposed always to solve any trade imbalance problem by devaluing the currency of the country experiencing an unfavorable balance of trade. If money wages of American workers did not increase, then the result of this classical theory solution would be to lower the standard of living of the average American worker until it approached the standard of living of Chinese workers. And as endnote number 2 indicates, mainstream economists assume always all possible economic problems. J.M. Keynes, The Collected Writings of John Maynard Keynes, 25, edited by D. Moggridge, Macmillan, London, 1980, page 27. Op. Cit. Page 176. J.M. Keynes, 1941, Post-War Currency Policy, printed in The Collected Writings of John Maynard Keynes, 25, edited by D. Moggridge, Macmillan, London, 1980, pages 21-22. Correspondent banking will have to operate through the International Clearing Agency, with each central bank regulating the international relations and operations of its domestic banking firms. Small-scale smuggling of currency across borders, etc., can never be completely eliminated, but such movements are merely a flea on a dog's back, a minor, but not debilitating, irritation. If, however, most of the residents of a nation hold and use, in violation of legal tender laws, a foreign currency for domestic transactions and as a store of value, this is evidence of a lack of confidence in the government and its monetary authority. Unless confidence is restored, all attempts to restore economic prosperity will fail. 9. Whatever excessive credit balances that are redistributed shall be apportioned among the debtor nations, perhaps based on a formula which is inversely related to each debtor's per capita income and directly related to the size of its international debt, to be used to reduce debit balances at the clearing union.